Thank you very much, Chantal, and thank you very much to the organisers for inviting me to come along to speak to you today. And very many congratulations on the workshop of this morning. It really is an excellent start to your programme, raising many of the issues that we have been struggling with in the UK for a number of years. And indeed, it's that experience that I would like to share with you this afternoon. It's an experience which has been going on now for 10 years. It's effectively an experiment in governance that we've been undertaking. I'll be very keen to hear your views on whether or not you think it's a success so far and where we should be going in the future. But I would like to suggest to you that there's little about it, although the context is UK Biobank. I'd like to suggest that there's little about it that's actually UK in terms of the approaches to governance that we might actually all take collectively. I think that there are lessons for all of us about what counts as good governance. And I think the key question we need to be asking here is how governance mechanisms can remain fit for purpose over time. That is the key issue. This is the outline of my talk this afternoon. I'll give a brief introduction to UK Biobank itself, what it's trying to achieve, its purposes. I will then give an outline of the history of the ethical governance approach that we've actually adopted with respect to UK Biobank, before moving on to discuss the work of the Ethics and Governance Council, of which I am the chair, as Chantal has already indicated, and looking at the nature of the council and its work in practice, and how that work has actually changed and evolved since it was set up 5 years ago. Moving on from that, I'd like to focus on what I think is an absolutely crucial issue here, and this obviously came out this morning in the workshop, which is the imperative to involve publics in terms of any governance mechanisms that we actually set up, because fundamental to the success of biobanking is trust and the trust relationship, before finally moving on to some conclusions about our experiences in the UK. So, an introduction to UK Biobank. The project's purpose is to provide a research resource for research with the aim of improving the prevention, diagnosis and treatment of illness and promoting health throughout society for public benefit. It is determinedly the case that this resource is to be there for international sharing, and it should be shared with researchers, whether they come from a public or a private background, and whether that be for the purposes of commercial or public benefit. The resource ultimately will contain health and lifestyle data and biological samples from volunteers from the UK aged between 40 to 69. The funding at the moment is £61 million initially, and more recently they've received £6 million further pounds to do certain enhancements to the core protocol. The target is to recruit 500,000 participants by 2010. The current total, as you can see here from the slide, is 385. We understand from UK Biobank they're actually ahead of schedule, and they should reach the target of 500,000 by the summer of next year. Recruitment to UK Biobank is by invitation. It's not possible to volunteer out of the blue for UK Biobank. There are 24 recruitment sites that are located or have been located throughout the UK, and approximately 6 of these operate at any one time. They are located in accessible and well-known parts of the country, usually cities, but they also there's an example in Wales of a travelling recruitment centre to try and reach hard-to-reach groups. They're usually located in areas such as shopping centres and near bus stations, so that individuals can come along more easily. Recruitment at the moment seems to take place at the total of about 600 people a day, which means in practice there are 18,000 samples per day that have to be processed and stored. This takes place in a custom-built location just near the city of Manchester, costing £4.5 million, a high-tech facility where the blood and the urine are stored. It's designed ultimately to hold around 10 million samples. That should be minus 80 degrees for the next 30 years. If it was 80 degrees Celsius, that wouldn't be very useful as a public resource. People who agree to participate in UK Biobank agree to the following: to provide information about their health, lifestyle, memory, work and family history. They agree to undergo some physical measurements, including the donation of biological samples, such as blood and urine. They agree to allow UK Biobank to access information for health-related records, and that's one of the key issues that we need to explore together as to what does that exactly mean, health-related records, because the broad purpose of UK Biobank is to create a resource for health-related purposes, and that, of course, could be incredibly broad. Individuals grant consent for researchers to access data and samples for uses that meet the purposes of the project, and ultimately they also grant permission to allow the possibility of reconsent for the future, depending on how the particular individual research develops. This slide tries to describe the somewhat complicated governance arrangements that exist with respect to UK Biobank. It's funded primarily by the Medical Research Council, a public body in the UK, but using public money, and the Wellcome Trust, although you can see there are other partners from Scottish Executive, which is now Scottish Government, North West Development Agency, and the Department of Health for England and Wales. Bottom left-hand corner here, UK Biobank itself has been set up as a charitable company. It has collaborating centres in 22 different universities around the country. Sitting apart from it and independent from UK Biobank is the Ethics and Governance Council, of which I am chair. UK Biobank is accountable to the Ethics and Governance Council, and in turn the Ethics and Governance Council is accountable to the funders and ultimately to the UK public and beyond. And from a scientific perspective, in the bottom right-hand corner there is an International Scientific Advisory Board which advises UK Biobank on its science and advises the funders on the continuation of the project. But what I want to focus on this afternoon is the novel approach which has been taken to governance. There are effectively two features of this novel approach. One is the development of what's called an ethics and governance framework, which I will refer to as the framework, and the other is the establishment of an ethics and governance council, which I will refer to as the council. In terms of the ethics and governance framework, this is a public document which describes the commitments and standards under which UK Biobank will effectively operate during its creation, its maintenance, and throughout the lifetime of the resource. More particularly, it describes the commitments of UK Biobank, first and foremost to its participants, but also to research users and to society more broadly. And it's intended as a high-level public document that is expected to evolve over time as the project itself evolves. It's a key innovative feature of the governance framework, and at the moment, we're in the third iteration of this ethics and governance framework from 2007, but further revisions are being undertaken in light of more recent developments, about which I will say more presently. The framework makes it clear that consent here is to participate in UK Biobank with all which that entails. It affirms the right to withdraw at any time, and there are 3 different options for withdrawal, and I'll come back to this in due course. And it clearly makes a commitment to protect the confidentiality of both the samples and the data of individuals. No identifiable samples or data would be released to researchers from within the resource. The framework also confirms that UK Biobank is there to act as the steward of the resource, as the custodian of the resource, all the time acknowledging that it's probably the case in English law that UK Biobank is the legal owner of the samples themselves, and certainly of any database that is developed using information from participants or any other sources. The framework also describes the principles of access, the principles which will govern access here, but what it does not develop or does not yet articulate are the procedures under which the access will actually be granted. And that's actually a piece of work that we are developing closely at the moment with UK Biobank in terms of exactly how they will go about granting access with respect to the resource. They do not anticipate granting any access until at least January 2011. So that would be at least 6 months after they'd finished recruitment. But there are many, many complicated questions about what those procedures will actually involve. And I'll say a little bit more again once more about those presently. The framework also describes the broad benefit sharing expectations that arise from UK Biobank, and we feel that this is absolutely core to the importance of trust within the framework. And those benefit sharing arrangements include, for example, the requirement from anybody who accesses UK Biobank to return results, including negative results, to the resource, and also to ensure that they publish information within a reasonable time frame. In terms of the development of this ethical framework, as I say, this has been an ethics experiment that's been going on for about 10 years. And as Bernice mentioned in her talk this morning, the development of the ethical framework under the auspices of UK Biobank was actually delayed so that public engagement exercises could actually be carried out. And that when this actually took place in 2000, 2001, 2002, it was a process of consultations with a range of stakeholders in the public sector, health professionals, and experts in a number of different areas. In order to assist the funders in deciding how to go about organising or governing UK Biobank, they established an interim advisory group on ethics and governance, of which I was a part, and it was our task to try to advise on ethics and governance in tandem with the development of the protocol, which was, to say the least, a very interesting experiment, because, of course, we could only advise depending on what UK Biobank was actually proposing to do, but as they kept changing their mind, we had to keep changing our advice. So it took about 2 to 3 years before we actually came up with some sort of framework that we felt would actually be sufficiently robust to respond to the protocol that eventually emerged from UK Biobank. Once that framework emerged and once our proposals came to fruition, they were published and there was a consultation exercise carried out, the result of which was the formation of the Ethics and Governance Council, and that was supported strongly by evidence that was coming out from public engagement exercises, that it was felt that that was an important aspect of the trust model, which effectively forms the basis of UK Biobank. So to say more about the Council itself, the Council exists to monitor UK Biobank and its conformance with the framework. It advises the project on revisions to that framework, and it also advises UK Biobank on the interests of participants and the public more generally. UK Biobank is there to encourage research in the public interest, and it's also there to advise exactly what does that mean in the public interest, by no means an easy task. Members are appointed by the Medical Research Council and Wellcome Trust themselves, following what are called in the UK the Nolan Principles of Standards in Public Life. More recently, the funders have agreed that it's appropriate that the Council itself should in the future be responsible for appointing its own members, which I think also speaks more to the independent nature of the Council. So, we've got an ethical framework, we've got an ethical council. But why have this framework over and above everything that already exists? In the UK, there are a plethora of laws, regulations, ethical approval mechanisms and guidance that already apply to an entity such as UK Biobank. A recent report from the House of Lords on genomic medicine indicated that researchers in this field probably have to negotiate 46 different pieces of legislation before they can actually do the work that they would like to do. So the question is, well, why go beyond that? Why go beyond what already exists? The answers are manifold. First of all, remembering that we've been looking at these issues for a period of at least 10 years, it goes back to this issue of broad consent. The basis of UK Biobank is broad consent, and the breadth of the project, the longitudinal nature of the project, means that it's by no means clear exactly how we should proceed into the future when we have consent which is based on this broad model. Thank you. Moreover, despite the fact that we have extensive controls, extensive regulation in the UK, there are nonetheless gaps. And most notably, there are limitations in the remits of ethics committees which do not have an ongoing responsibility to monitor research once they have approved it in an upfront fashion. So therefore, the suggestion is that the Council itself actually exists as an additional safeguard, as a possible foundation of trust, to act as a trusted third party. It's important to note, however, that the mantra of the Ethics and Governance Council is to speak about UK Biobank, not for UK Biobank. If you ask me questions this afternoon about what UK Biobank is doing, I can tell you what they've told me they're doing, but it's not my role to sort of speak on their behalf. The Council itself was established in November 2004. It's a multidisciplinary group that draws on a wide range of expertise from law, ethics, biomedical sciences, social sciences, policy and consumer groups. At the moment, there are 12 members, and we meet 4 times a year with at least one public meeting. I would say to you now that that's not enough, I think, in order for us to do our job effectively. We also have a lot of work that is done via email and other communication mechanisms in the interim, and we've also set up 3 subgroups in order to focus on what we think are key priority areas that affecting UK Biobank, being access and intellectual property, information technology and security, and communication and public engagement. So we have these 3 groups that work in tandem with the Council itself. In terms of our relationship with UK Biobank, we effectively act as a critical ethical friend. It's our role to hold up a mirror to UK Biobank and provide critical and constructive advice. This quote at the bottom of this slide indicates it comes from the framework, and it talks about effectively our powers and probably more importantly the limitation of our powers. So whereas normally we will communicate our reflections directly to UK Biobank itself, if we were not satisfied, we would then take any concerns to the UK Biobank board. If we were unsatisfied by that, we would go to the UK Biobank funders, and ultimately we could go public, the so-called nuclear option. Problem with nuclear option, as we all know, is you can only really use it once. And we've never had to use it, I'm very, very pleased to say. But nonetheless, it does show that there are levels of tolerances whereby issues can be escalated if the communication between UK Biobank and this independent council is not working as well as it might. It's important to note, however, that the council is not a creature of law, and it is not a creature with any tangible sanction. Effectively, this is a governance arrangement by agreement. And equally importantly, I think it's necessary to point out the things that the council is not there to do. The council is not there to assume responsibility for the ethical management of the resource. That is the role of UK Biobank. As I've already said, it's not our responsibility to speak on behalf of UK Biobank, but rather about UK Biobank, and it's the responsibility of UK Biobank to own and develop the framework and any associated policies. We stand to the side of it, and we advise and monitor accordingly. So this month, November, is the 5th anniversary of the Ethics and Governance Council. I just want to reflect on some of the changes that have occurred to the work of the Council in light of the developments within UK Biobank itself. And I would suggest that the focus of the Council's work has changed over time in according to, I'd say, 3 different areas of development. First of all, when UK Biobank was developing and refining its protocol, I would suggest that the role of the Council was advisory. We were there to advise on associated policies and procedures such as standard operating procedures for capacity, for consent, etc., the content of information leaflets and the consent form. In that sense, arguably in that first phase, which lasted from 2004 to perhaps 2006, the Council acted pretty much like an ethics committee. I'm not sure it added that much value. I think it added value directly in terms of the work it did, but in terms of a governance approach, I don't think it added value to that which already existed in terms of the ethical systems that are already in place in the UK. Thereafter, since UK Biobank started recruiting in April 2007, we've moved much more to a monitoring role. We monitor complaints and inquiries. We monitor their provisions for the development of information security, which is ongoing. So, for example, today, 27th of November 2009, our subgroup on information security and IT is actually visiting UK Biobank, specifically looking at the provisions that exist with respect to security and asking some difficult questions about exactly how this is going to be developed and move forward. So it's an ongoing sort of dynamic monitoring process. We also look at issues such as proposals for follow-up, for feedback, etc. From 2010 onwards, and indeed it's already started, from 2010 onwards, I think a body like the Council will move much more into a foresighting role. A role where we're looking forward to imagine what will be the challenges that an entity such as UK Biobank will have to address, and how will it actually go about addressing them. And as I've already indicated to you, I think that key among those, are issues about access. Other aspects of our work. As part of the Council's budget, the Council has commissioned research. There are 3 particular commissioned pieces of research I think are worth flagging up. The first was a scoping study on public attitudes regarding biobanking relating issues. We wanted to know what was out there and what gaps existed as to whether or not we could actually fill a gap and again add value as opposed to just replicating work that's already been done. And one of the gaps we felt that we identified was attitudes with respect to access issues, and in particular access issues which lead to commercialisation and benefit sharing. And we commissioned a study in 2008, which is available on our website, a public document, and it makes for very, very interesting reading. I think the key points that come out of that require further exploration, either for UK Biobank or another context, are the following. First of all, those who were surveyed seemed to be more concerned about security than they were about anonymity. So it's much more about trusted parties and being willing to sort of allow trusted parties to have access to data and samples rather than necessarily not having your identity disclosed. Secondly, UK Biobank in the framework makes a guarantee that it will resist very, very strongly any access attempts by the police to access the resource. Interestingly, it seems that members of the British public who were surveyed seemed less concerned about that on the basis that, well, if there's nothing to hide, then why shouldn't it be the case that the police should have access to something like UK Biobank? So although UK Biobank were actually trying to send a very clear message about what they would do, that doesn't necessarily reflect what the expectations are with respect to that sort of access. I think far more worryingly, however, there seems to be concern, or an increased level of concern, about international transfers of data and samples. And that is a fundamental problem, given what I said earlier on, that UK Biobank determinedly exists to act as a resource that will transfer data and probably will transfer samples on an international basis. It cannot fulfill its purpose alone. Although it has 500,000 people recruited to the resource, that cannot work unless it involves sharing on an international level. So UK Biobank needs to address what the core root of those sorts of concerns and see how it might have to change its approach. And finally, our public attitude survey confirmed that there are quite strong reservations about commercialisation. Not that commercial entities might actually have access to an entity such as UK Biobank, but that there may be excessive profit. And if there's excessive profit, what will be done about that in terms of benefit sharing arrangements? All of that will have to be refined in the UK Biobank access and intellectual property policy. Finally, we conducted a conceptual analysis in terms of the public interest and public good, because the resource exists in order to further these concepts. It's actually very difficult, as we all know, to pin down what does it actually mean to manage and use a resource to further these concepts. The Council took from that particular survey, or drafted from that particular survey, a living document about its views on what it means to advise, certainly, in the public interest and for the public good. We see that as a living document which will evolve over time as the project develops and as particular requests for access come forward. Just want to share with you a few examples of some unforeseen challenges, which I think also show how there is added value with respect to the work of the Council. The framework initially spoke about about withdrawal options. There are 3 withdrawal options. It's possible to be asked no longer to be contacted. It's possible to ask that UK Biobank no longer obtains any information about one individual, or the ultimate option, it's possible to say that I want no further use. In the original version of the framework, UK Biobank said it would destroy all samples of health-related information or tangible samples collected by individuals, although understanding that some may have been passed on to researchers. It became clear, however, as UK Biobank began to develop its policies and began to develop its IT structure, that that was simply not possible. The nature of the IT system meant you could not have that absolute guarantee. So after discussions with ourselves, the ethics and governance framework had to be refined, and it was refined along the following lines. Yes, there's a guarantee that information and samples collected previously will no longer be used, but that some information would have to be held at least for archival purposes. The Council didn't feel that individual participants had to be consulted or reconsented again, because the fundamental guarantee of no further use for research stood true. But the realities of the expectations about what could and could not be done with one's data had changed, and therefore people had to understand that. So the framework and the information leaflet was revised, and the whole story has been told on the pages of UK Biobank and the Council's websites. I've already indicated that publics were actively engaged during the development of UK Biobank and the framework, and it was effectively from this engagement that the idea of the Council developed. And we can see here, particularly the second quote there, that participants said generally that any oversight body that existed, which they felt should exist, should ensure that standards of behaviour and ethics were maintained and continue to reflect the public mood as the public consensus changes over time, but with the original terms of the consent being respected that were being given by volunteers. Going back to my earlier point right at the beginning of my talk, I think the fundamental question here is how can we ensure, as far as it's possible to ensure, that governance mechanisms remain fit for purpose over time with changing expectations. One clear aspect of that, I think, is the need for ongoing engagement. The model of broad consent that's been adopted by UK Biobank can't stand alone. It has to come with an element of robust governance. Part of that governance has to include obligations on the part of UK Biobank to continue to engage with and to communicate with their participants to ensure that they can exercise their rights at any time. Effectively, this develops consent as a process, not as a one-off event up front. It's consent as a process, and it means that engagement is integral to the workings of UK Biobank. There are various things that are going on in terms of engagement with the public. One I'd like to draw your attention to is a meeting that we're having next month in London, which is to consider how the Council, UK Biobank, the funders, and indeed others involved in biobanking might actually best involve publics in governance frameworks. We've invited a range of speakers to come talk to us about different public engagement exercises, whether it be citizens' juries, whether it be deliberative democracy, whether it be shareholder or stakeholder involvement, and we hope that that will actually inform our practice with respect to advising UK Biobank, but also it will encourage UK Biobank to do more in terms of engaging with their participants. Some final reflections on maintaining the trust relationship. About 1 in 10 of those who are invited to take part in UK Biobank agree. About 1 in 500 then drop out, which seems quite satisfactory. There seems to be no pattern emerging of core concerns about why people would drop out from the project. But the real test is going to come when there is a crisis. And there hasn't been a crisis so far. There have only been a few potential challenges to the trust relationship, such as withdrawal option. More recently, there have been some questions asked about whether or not the resource could be used to create admixed embryos. A commentary appeared in the Lancet. I can talk about that if you're interested. But the big challenges effectively lie ahead, particularly when we're talking about access. From the point of view of the Council, however, I would suggest that anecdotal evidence indicates that the existence of the Council now and into the future is seen by participants as being extremely important. My final point, in conclusion then, this Council is an experiment. It was established in direct response to the broad model of consent adopted by UK Biobank and because of the long-term nature of the resource. The framework and the Council are intended to act as an extra safeguard for participants in the public and to provide a foundation for trust. Whether that's actually the case remains to be seen. The monitoring aspect of the Council's remit, I think, is important as a complement to traditional ethical review by ethics committees. But what we absolutely must avoid in this context is adding to the regulatory burden unless there's added value. And I would suggest to you that in the context of this example, this experiment, there is some added value. That comes particularly in the context of the long-term nature of UK Biobank, and indeed the long-term nature of all biobanks. I would argue that a body like the Council provides an informed or responsive input over time, acting in the public interest and keeping key principles at the heart of its decisions. The broad consent model brings complementary obligations, the exact parameters of which we're not yet clear on, but I think it's through work like the body of the Council we can promote and facilitate good governance and good science in the public interest. Thank you.